Hello, welcome to my channel and thank you for being here. Today I'm going to be beginning a new series which is part of a trilogy, work in progress, the working title for which is Joining the String, Dispossession, Resistance and Genocide and Remembering in South Africa. That trilogy looks at three epochs in what I call the foundational history of contemporary South Africa, which is the colonization and settling of this region. So theoretically from 1652 until 1879. It looks at three distinct movements that took place in that period. I'm going to be working through the one that is complete, which is Unsettled, the 100-year war of resistance by Xhosa against Boer and British. And this is a book and an exhibition that toured quite extensively. The two other parts of the trilogy, one of which has been shown sort of as a work in progress, which I call Return. It's also Dispossession, Resistance, Genocide, because it looks at the Khoi and the San, the Bushmen, their dispossession and resistance and re-emergence in the case of the Khoi, who were culturally disappeared. And the third part will look at slavery, because this country had 200 years of slavery, almost 200 years of slavery, and which we seem to have forgotten largely. Although I think there is a big project to remember and include that into our understanding of who we are as a people, because large parts of our population are people who were brought here as slaves, actually. So, Unsettled, I will be working through this book and the images, but I'm going to begin today with an introduction to the project. And I'll begin by reading a few texts from this book. There is a jacket text which I thought was quite prudent to read, because it does kind of frame the project that was produced for this publication, which says that in Unsettled, South African photographer Cedric Nunn, best known for his photographs of apartheid resistance, turns his lens to the landscape of the Eastern Cape, site of the longest and most complex anti-colonial confrontation in South Africa's history, the 100-year War of Resistance, spanning a century and encompassing 9 discrete frontier wars. The resistance of the Xhosa against the colonized forces, first the Boers and then the British, was an incredible feat that has been all but erased from the history books. Nunn's photo essay attempts to reclaim that long-lost history by engaging with the landscape of that resistance as the Xhosa traditional homeland, as the site of surprising victories and devastating defeats, as the site of horrific massacres and mass population displacements, and as the modern-day Eastern Cape facing its own challenges. Nunn captures colonial scars in the form of ruins, environmental damage, displaced people, and acts of erasure. But the project itself is a reclamation of Xhosa history and the Xhosa perspective of the frontier wars. And as such, Nunn also uncovers acts of memory and excavates recollections long buried. Additional historical, contextual, and critical commentary is provided by Zexim Da, Jeff Perez, and M. Nilika Jayawadeen. Cedric Nunn's Unsettled is an important document and serves as a first step in recognizing the importance of the Xhosa resistance to the history of the Eastern Cape and South Africa. There are some acknowledgements which I'm going to read at the end of the text that I will read now, which is the text I wrote. Quite a lengthy text. It's about a 20-minute text, so please bear with me. It's a text that I wrote and that is included in this monograph. So I'll read it now, and I quote, "As you can imagine, photographing an event as momentous as a 100-year-long war needs a lot of travel just to get to all the places that were implicated in it. The idea came to me in a flash, as these ideas sometimes do. I was opening a show in Berlin and I had the honor of having the Honorable Makhenkesi Stoffile, South African ambassador to Germany, open the show. In my chat to him afterwards, I realized how little I knew of the Eastern Cape generally, and it dawned on me that there had been this incredible conflict that had shaped this region. And in fact, South Africa, fundamentally. The idea excited me, and as a photographer, there are many ideas that you're confronted with, but one that actually enlivens you is rare. And this idea stayed with me. I almost like to think that I responded to an ancestor's calling. I have these feelings about this project. I just met incredible people that guided this project and made it possible. So I began to think and read and find as much information as I could, because I really knew nothing about the 100-years war period, and I knew very little about the Eastern Cape. As a photographer with 30 years experience, the Eastern Cape had always eluded me somehow. I had spent very little time working in this region. Although I had been there and done some work there, it was not enough to get a grip on the province. I lived in Johannesburg for many years, and I'm now based in Durban, but I originate from KwaZulu-Natal. I had my ideas about what the Eastern Cape was about. Whenever I thought about the Eastern Cape, I thought about a failed state, a dysfunctional place with potholed roads. I had these pictures of the Transkei, rolling hills, idyllic beaches, crime, fishing, hippies hanging out in Port St. John's. That was my picture of the Eastern Cape. When I moved back to KwaZulu-Natal in 2007, after 25 years in Johannesburg, I moved to a place that was fairly close to the border of the Eastern Cape, and I decided I wanted to engage with this province. This project has been an extraordinary way to encounter it. My very first choice of an author to write an essay for this book would have been Uruguayan journalist, novelist, and activist, the late Eduardo Galeano, famous for his writings on South America. He was particularly noted for his insights on the perspective of memory and remembering and imagining our origins and history and our passage in time. His project was about building historical memory against the desert of organized forgetting, to quote Eduardo Galeano. That resonated for me because, for me, that's what the frontier war was. Apart from some specialists, South Africans have largely forgotten it. And I have to wonder if perhaps that has been a kind of organized forgetting, in the way that we don't particularly remember or acknowledge this extraordinary historic resistance, especially by the Xhosa, that took place over that period. So I'm going to need coffee for sustenance during this. I located my project around the idea of resistance rather than a frontier clash, which it was in some ways. It was, of course, also a frontier clash. I gleaned a huge amount of information from Noel Mostad's extraordinary tome, Frontiers, where he explains the developments in that region, speaking about the fact that there were indigenous people living in the Eastern Cape, and then the migration of Africans who moved into the space, which was followed by Europeans also arriving there somewhat later, and then this extraordinary clash of civilizations that happened there. Mostad locates this clash as a significant global moment, in the sense that for the process that was taking place post-Enlightenment and post-industrialization, the conquest of this region, strategically and geopolitically, was of great significance, and perhaps similar to more contemporary moments that are taking place in parts of the Middle East and Asia today, where incredibly significant spaces like the Ukraine, Syria, or Iraq, contested spaces, are being grappled over. My understanding of what took place in the Eastern Cape was about the need to control this region. Progressively, as things unfolded, when the British annexed the Cape, they initially had no intention of going much further than that. At that point in time, there was a lot of contestation in the British Foreign Office, though. For many, a great reluctance to engage any further in the Cape, particularly in the Western Cape, which was their refueling station. Yet as the trade route became more contested between the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Spanish, and the French, there was an increasing need to control it, so that the British would not be denied access to it. And when the British had managed to achieve that, they began to realize that in order to keep control of it, they needed to conquer further. So that was the premise of beginning to understand the need to conquer what the British regarded as a fractious region. In fact, there were some people who were quite eager to reach a negotiated settlement around the control of the Cape, but perhaps the Hawks won the day in the Foreign Office, and ultimately a decision was made for the military to go out and play in the Eastern Cape, with disastrous consequences. So, how do you photograph a conflict that took place a long, long time ago? It obviously isn't easy. What became really apparent to me was that I would have to engage the landscape. And I'm not a landscape photographer per se. While I have produced a lot of images and photographed land issues from the 1980s onwards, I haven't regarded myself as a landscape photographer. And so it was a huge challenge for me to engage with this history from that angle. But that seemed the obvious way to go for me, to engage the space as land that was contested, land that was the site of trauma, but land that was also beautiful, enticing, alluring. As I traveled the length and breadth of the province, I tried to imagine myself in that time. Something I discovered along the way is that, in fact, I have 1980, 1820 settler heritage. So I tried to imagine my ancestors arriving in this place, what they would have seen and experienced. It's not that easy now to imagine it, though, because the landscape is significantly different, but aspects of it can be seen. The indigenous people, whether it was the Khoi or the Xhosa, had a different attitude towards this land, a more spiritual sense that I think still exists even to this day. A sense of land as being not something that you own, but something that owns you. I try to imagine a lot of that. So a lot of this project is about imagining, my imagining. I'm not a historian, I'm not an academic. I'm someone who engages with things in a visual way. Thanks to a Mellon Foundation Senior Scholarship Fellowship, based at Rhodes University in Grahamstown, then Grahamstown, now Makanda, I was able to meet people who had done a lot of work of thinking and work around these issues, and I was able to benefit from that work that had preceded me. While my idea wasn't an original one, and many other people have engaged the issues of this period, I'd like to think that as a visual person, I have brought something other, not quite different necessarily, but a project that sees and imagines this period in quite a condensed form. There were many places that I engaged with, that I visited and photographed, as you can imagine. A period that spans that kind of time frame had me swept to and fro throughout the province. Places like Fish, the Great Fish, or Ingluba River, which was a significant border and so a significant site, and which I photographed at various points. Closer to home is the Ekazini Memorial, which I'm told will be relocated and which has apparently been vandalized much more since I made images there. Southwell, a place one struggles to find, because if you blink, you miss it. And Southwell was where my 1820 settlers were located, Robert Dunn. And yeah. And there's a long anecdotal story that goes with it, which I'll include when I do the image. Which I discovered my ancestors had been settled in only after I had visited it. My ancestors, both the Biggers and the Dunns, left the Eastern Cape within 13 or 15 years of arriving there in the 1820s and moved to KwaZulu-Natal. They, like other 1820 settlers, had paid passage to the British government to come to South Africa, only to realize that they had been sent into a war zone and were being used as pawns by the British. They ultimately packed up and left, and soon integrated with the seemingly far more ferocious tribe, the Zulus, in Port Natal, now Durban, and I'm the product of that integration. Then there was Theophilus, which is not signposted at all, and which the ancestors really had to work hard to help me locate. I went there with Professor Julie Wells, an historian at Rhodes, who had been there 20 years before, the head historian, in fact, at Rhodes at the time, now retired, I believe, who had been there 20 years before, but who really had no clue as to how to get there again. Eventually, we found the place, which is an extraordinary place to visit. There were only the ruins of the town that existed there from the 1820s until it was destroyed by 1820 settlers and the British in 1853. It was destroyed because the people who inhabited that town, freed slaves and Khoikhoi, joined the Cat River Rebellion and rose up against the colony and paid a devastating price. Probably hundreds of thousands of people died during this conflict, that is the entire 100-year war conflict. And for me, it dawned more and more the degree of the heroism of their resistance that was eventually equally as tragic. Azana Cave is another such place on the banks of the Great Fish or Ingcoba River, where the Ndlambe tribe had hidden their women and children, but whom the British ultimately massacred there. And then, of course, the Bosberg, where the original conflict began in 1779, where I visited the ruins of the Prinsloo farm, the Prinsloo's being credited by historians for creating the first major conflict of the many that continued for 100 years. When you understand that Colonel John Graham's, after whom Grahamstown is named, offensive to clear the Zeerveld, what is now Albany, of all its Xhosa inhabitants, was a kind of ethnic cleansing of its time, and that the 1820 settlers were sent to inhabit the area as a buffer after the Xhosa had been forcibly removed, you see and engage with that area a bit differently now as you drive through the landscape. I visited the memorial to the great cattle killing in King Williamstown, which is a sad indictment of how we memorialize things in this country. I tried not to cover too many battle sites, and I also tried not to photograph too many forts, even though this area has one of the highest concentrations of forts in the world, I'm told, which is further testimony of how formidable a foe the Xhosa were to the British. And this is another thing that struck me as someone who is half Zulu and who grew up imbibing the myth of the Zulu Warrior. The Zulu people having been as formidable as the Xhosa people before Shaka imposed his unification onto the Zulu people, but which ultimately fractured them. There are two ironies for me. The irony of the fact that I had tried to avoid photographing forts, and yet my first exhibition of this body of work found itself located in a fort, Fort Selwyn, which is now a museum. I see my exhibition there as having been a type of occupation of the fort. I invited the Nkosi, chief of the Ndlamba people, to speak at the opening. And so this fort was suddenly full of its foe, but in this instance as celebrants, celebrating the opening of the exhibition and their ongoing survival and resistance, some might say. The other irony for me is the idea of the heroic Zulu warrior. In 1879, when the Eastern Cape was considered defeated, it is recorded that the British loaded up all of their armaments and their troops and headed for Port Natal, now present-day Durban, and within 3 months overpowered the Zulu, who are nevertheless still recorded heroically as formidable warriors in most historical accounts. That is also why Galliano's comment about organized forgetting gripped me. We were encouraged to imagine something different to what in fact actually happened. As historian Michael Parenti has eloquently asserted, up until very recently, history has always been written not just by the victors, but by the elite classes amongst them, who manipulated how we understand history by eliminating any opposition to their favored constructed perspectives. This war had devastating consequences for the people, who were mostly the victims. One of these consequences that is not spoken of very often is the divisions that exist to this day amongst the Xhosa people. The British were masters of divisionary tactics when engaging an enemy. One of the salient things I've come to understand is that a large part of the history that emerged from this period was written not only by the victors, but also by the collaborators with the victors. There was a substantial amount of collaboration by Xhosa people who sided with the British during this war, and who were the first missionary converts who were progressively schooled in Western education. They were the first products of the missionary schools, and who went on to occupy high state and provincial offices, with their legacy evident still today. But there have been and still are others who resisted and continue to resist to this day, and continue to be alienated. These divisions exist because these individuals don't have generations of having been scholars. They were not that visible in powerful governmental positions, and their networks were not as engaged in various aspects of society. One articulation of the legacy of this history, though, which won the day, is that of Western progress and the success of the mission schools in producing those new scholars and professionals that a modern state requires. But to this day, there are still people who live in the vast reserves that are denuded, literally, of topsoil, that are overcrowded. But when I encounter them, I still see an echo in them of the people that were described 400 years ago, proud people who are generous and, and welcoming and full of the irony of their predicament, but not necessarily broken or gripped by hate or those negative things that can destroy a person. They've managed to overcome that and to see things in a very long perspective, with very long vision. The irony is that the ones who have collaborated and are sitting with the largesse, the spoils of their collaboration, of that collaboration, and the powerful positions and the resources that brings, I get a sense that they pay a price for that to this day. It's the price of the easy resort to cronyism, to corruption, because that has been a part of that culture for a long, long time. Somebody like Makanda, who attacked Grahamstown in 1819, and who was, in fact, the first person to engage with the missionaries as an intellectual, as a philosopher, and as a statesperson for his people, who tried to engage with the English and understand the spiritual underpinnings of their civilization, was seen and has been maligned by the other side as having been fickle, first in that he engaged with Christianity, but then revealed himself to be the general of an attacking army. Indeed, he was all of these things. He was also a seer, spiritual seer for the Xhosa people. The Xhosa people have been and still are a very spiritual people, and many of them are in fact now Christians. Ntsikana, instead of Makanda, has been presented in the history as the first successful Christian convert. Not necessarily for having been the ideal convert, for he adjusted the directives of the faith to suit himself and his own needs and desires, but because his descendants and followers remained in the church, and so had access to printing presses and education. And it is their viewpoints that have remained intact to this day. These were the kind of things I encountered and engaged with in executing and producing this project. Another thing that struck me as I began this project was that I realized that in fact the bigger story was that of the conquest of the Khoi and the San, or the Bushmen. I'm pursuing a trilogy here, and my next project will focus on the dispossession and re-emergence of the Khoi and the San as a First Nation people, who technically were made to be non-people for more than 100 years. The land restitution process, for instance, didn't include them at all initially. I see the means of engaging with this not as an historical telling, but as the re-emergence of a people that are taking back the pride they have and the sense of who they are as a people, and proudly asserting their presence back into their country. The third part of the trilogy will look at slavery, because slavery is the elephant in the room in South Africa. The dysfunctionality seen in so many of the ghettos of the Cape and many other places in the country owes its legacy to that. Unsettled is the first part of this trilogy, which looks not only backwards for the sake of recounting history, but does so for the sake of understanding where we find ourselves in our current history going forward. Unsettled is also a paean to those many forebears and ancestors who paid a heavy price for the defense of freedom, who have largely been forgotten in the depths of time, to whom we owe a deep gratitude, and in a sense, whose struggles need to be continued. And then I would just like to do a few acknowledgements. And the acknowledgement that this entire book is dedicated to is in remembrance and honor of the many ancestors who fell in defense of our freedom. And finally, some acknowledgements, very important. As I said earlier, this project was originally inspired by a conversation with the Honorable South African Ambassador to Germany, Theophilus, for which I am grateful. Inclusion by the Market Photo Workshop in the Social Landscapes Project, a French-South Africa partnership, allowed for the project to kick off and was invaluable in ensuring that as so often the case, as is so often the case, the idea was not stillborn. The Arles Photo Festival allowed for the first international manifestation of the project, and the feedback from that process was key in shaping the rest of the work. For enabling a great leap forward, a special word of thanks goes to Professor Anthea Garman and the Rhodes University School of Journalism and Media Studies, who directed me to the Mellon Foundation and the Senior Scholarship Award, which made the bulk of the work possible. Nkosi Makeneni of Ndlambe Village and the Ndlambe people, and the community historian and spokesman Mr. Samuel Nokala, were instrumental in shaping my understanding of the saga from the perspective of the Xhosa people. Professor Julie Wells of the Rhodes University History faculty gave invaluable advice, hours of consultation, and background information, which was key to the project. Gray de Villiers, retired Fort Hare historian, generously gave invaluable input and time in the early stages of the project, which helped shape my approach. Jill Schoolman and the Pirogue Collective have been fantastic in their support for the work and the publishing of this monograph. So were Indra Wuso and the Wunderhorn Africa unstinting in their enthusiasm to publish the German edition. So there's an English and a German edition. Thanks to Dr. Ralph Seipel and Delia Klask, Tobias Lehr and Sizagile Angel Kumalo of Seipel Gallery for their unwavering and enthusiastic support. I am indebted to Tracy Muranik for editing skills and general support. Thanks also to Dennis De Silva and Andile Gomanisi of then Silvertone International for their great attention to detail and artistic interpretation of the scans and prints. Then to my daughter Lara Nunn and her mom Lindy Scholz for their great patience during my preoccupation and frequent absences, and their total support throughout the making of the work. And thank you for watching, because I'll conclude it here. And again, a reminder that if you like my work, please press like and press subscribe as well. It helps the channel grow. And thank you for now.